Okay, welcome everyone to our PEC Masterworks series pre-concert talk for our fifth Masterworks concert. I'm so pleased to welcome Arvilla Wendland, who is a member of our viola section. Arvilla, welcome to our pre-concert talk.
Thanks, glad to be here, Larry.
So we're performing in the first half of our program the Symphonia number 7 by Felix Mendelssohn. And I wanted to start off kind of generally about Mendelssohn. People talk about Mendelssohn being obviously genius composer, lived about the same amount of very short life as Mozart, who was also a genius composer. And Mendelssohn is just universally loved by musicians, performers, and audience concertgoers. What is it about Mendelssohn's music that resonates with people and with musicians?
Yeah, Mendelssohn has so many great works that are so much fun to play. From the string quartets to the octet to the symphonies, these symphonias that we're going to play one of for this Masterworks concert rarely are heard, I think partially just because they're small in stature. But Mendelssohn, I think, he's got that lyricism, the tunes, the beauty, the romanticism of the lines that I think speak to people. But it's also really clear and often energetic and lively. So it's a really nice balance between being really energetic, but also having those really beautiful tunes.
So, have you played many of these pieces of his symphonias in general?
No, this will be the only Symphonia that I've played, and I've been practicing it and listening, and being on the artistic planning committee for some of this season's programs. I certainly listened to a lot of them when we were considering which to play, and all the lovely tunes that you love from the symphonies and from the violin concerto, you get a sense of that, but you also get a sense of, the incredible energy that you hear, like in the Scottish Symphony that we played earlier this season, and some of the string quartets as well.
Yeah, same for me. These are pieces that have always been on my radar, and I've not had a chance to perform them, any of them. And so when we had the chance here, we were thinking about putting one of these on because we weren't sure how big an orchestra we could have. So we thought, let's find a symphonia, and a lot of them are divided up. You and I were in contact about this one has 4 viola parts, and this one divides this way, and we need to be able to perform it with a minimum number of musicians, and also then be able to expand it, which we are doing in the end. We just didn't know what it was going to be. And so when we didn't settle. I mean, immediately I loved number 7. But we were thinking about some other ones in consideration that were all in this kind of a longer time frame. But the thing that's just amazing about these is the maturity of his writing for being, like a 12 to 15-year-old, which is how old he was when he wrote these pieces. And I think it's also a testament to how he fit into the lineage of composers, how much he is retrospective in the way that he writes. And I know you and I have talked a little bit about how, Mendelssohn is known as the composer who brought Bach back, Johann Sebastian Bach. And as you practice this, I know we're going to perform it, but do you think of the things that sound like Bach stylistically? Do you approach it like Bach, or do you approach it kind of like a hybrid? Romantic, because he's kind of this romantic composer. Just curious about your philosophy.
Yeah, absolutely. In the first 3 movements, especially of the Symphonia, it sounds very classical, and I think that we'll play it very classically, like very, it'll sound more like Haydn. You'll hear the clarity that you would hear in Bach's writing. So you're going to hear that kind of influence from the past. And then, of course, some of the standard forms come into play as well. Bach was famous for fugues, that sort of imitation where one person plays a motive or a theme, and then it's passed around the group. And the last movement especially is really interesting to hear. It sounds, everybody plays together at the beginning. It's very busy, it's very joyful, it's very energetic. And then suddenly it's just the violas introducing the fugue subject. So yes, I think it feels more romantic when you have the tune or when it goes into more, more melodic material. But a lot of the time it feels very much like earlier music.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. And one thing about that last move, I think maybe we'll just kind of talk a little bit about the movement so that people know what to listen for. But let's start with that last movement, which it starts busy, like you were saying, and then it has this fugue. It's very similar. That fugue is similar to people who know Mozart symphonies, the 41st, his final symphony, the Jupiter Symphony, the last movement, the second theme, just like here, is a fugue. And it's very famous for being this 5-part imitation fugue in the strings that's introduced. And it's so like just awe-inspiring. It's like a cathedral being built. And in Mendelssohn's Seventh Symphonia, we have a similar kind of feeling with these fugue subjects popping up all over the place, kind of back and forth with that very busy tarantella theme. And the tarantella dance is something that Mendelssohn also used in his Italian symphony. So sartarella and tarantella kind of back and forth, but it's that triplet, very, very fast rhythm. And so people can look forward to hearing those two in contrast and how he combines them. There are the way that it opens. You were talking about that back and forth imitation. Some of that also happens in the opening movements. How would you describe this opening movement? Like, do you have any adjectives to kind of throw out? Because to me, it's just so invigorating. As soon as you hear it, it draws you in.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is just the energy of it. But it's, it's a little bit dark. There's a little bit of drama to it. And it's just so clean. You can hear everything. There's so much space around the statements and, so much unison playing that I think that just that energy, both of what's being played and the anticipation of what's going to come next is most powerful.
Yeah. Lots of contrast between the first bold unison statement and then the part that follows, and then back and forth. And then in big picture, the first movement to the second movement, you have a huge contrast, because that second movement is just, by contrast, very lyrical, smooth, longer lines. And then the third movement is the dance movement, which is basically a scherzo and trio. And normally then you would do a repeat of the scherzo, which Mendelssohn, for whatever reason, doesn't do. He kind of leaves us hanging. And so it's unresolved. And then that just brings us to that last tarantella fugue movement. But that third movement, to me, is great because it features the violas in a way. You have that long, sinuous line after everyone's playing these jump, 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 and you play this long, long line through that. And what I hope to accomplish with this piece is to have that clarity that you were talking about, that openness, where we can really hear separate that viola line from what everyone else is doing, and to create a way to hear the whole structure and to take it all in. And this is just, it's an absolute masterpiece. I'm so glad that we're doing it.
Yeah.
So go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, you mentioned in the planning that we were looking for things that we could play with just a few people, but could be expanded to be larger. And I think it's so exciting to get you back on stage and to really feel like, it's still a small group, but really to feel like it's, an orchestral performance. So it's going to be exciting.
Absolutely. Arvilla, thank you so much for joining us. We're now going to turn to Peter Rabinowitz, but Arvilla, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, and now I am very pleased to welcome Peter Rabinowitz, our program annotator. Peter, I'm so glad that you were joining us for this. We just spent the morning going through programming for the future. You are the chair of the artistic committee for planning future programs. And the audience should know that Peter is usually a person who suggests lots of music that he knows. He knows a huge repertoire of music, and a lot of it is unusual. And he's kind of known as a person who will pick pieces and suggest pieces that we all have to look up because we never heard of them. And Peter, do you have like, I mean, what? How would you define your interest in music?
Okay, well, that's a good question. If you can see in the background behind me is sort of a small part of my CD and record collection. And I'm a fanatic. It's an obsession. I mean, it's probably not a good thing, but I can't stop it. I've been doing it since I was a teenager. I actually have, it's a sort of double collection. On the one hand, just so people don't think that I only like weird stuff. I love the same thing everybody else loves, like the Rachmaninoff Third. I won't even begin to tell you how many recordings of the Rachmaninoff Third Concerto I have.
How many?
Well, it's over 60. Okay, so
oh my goodness.
So it isn't like, you know, and yet I love that piece. And when Natasha played it last year, I was so excited to get a chance to hear it yet again. At the same time, though, I like to leaven that with some unusual stuff. And anytime I get a chance to hear a composer I've never heard of before, I jump at that opportunity. And today's concert has, you know, is a mixture of Mendelssohn, who everybody knows and loves, and Louise Farrenc, who probably a lot of people haven't heard of yet, although they will soon. And I think that's a nice combination. New music doesn't necessarily mean contemporary music. And in this case, new music is 19th century music that we just don't know.
Right. So we have members of Symphoria performing the Nonet. And this is one of the better known of her works. She, Louise Farrenc, was a fantastic pianist. There's no piano in this chamber music work, which is kind of notable, being that it's one of her most famous works for chamber group. And it has all the winds. It has a horn. It has 4 string parts, including string bass, and it's a great combination. Why don't you tell us a little bit about this piece?
Okay, well, one of the things I like about this piece is what you just said about that combination of instruments. And most, of course, when people think of chamber music, they think of like a string quartet or maybe a piano quintet. There are lots and lots of pieces that are for weirder or more complicated groups of instruments that you never get to hear. So on a Syracuse Friends of Chamber Music, for instance, concert, you're unlikely to be able to gather up enough people to do this piece. So it gets kind of lost. It's too small for an orchestra, too big for a chamber music concert. One of the golden opportunities of COVID, which I hate to say anything positive about what's happened this year, but one thing that's positive is that it has forced us to go into different kinds of repertoire. And that repertoire of 10 to 20 players has suddenly become central for lots and lots of orchestras in this country. And this is one of those pieces. So it's a chance to hear, and it gives all of our principal woodwinds an opportunity to flaunt their abilities, which I think everybody will enjoy. We love hearing these players play their solos, and there are plenty of solos in this piece. Farrenc was when she was young, she studied with Anton Reicha, who was often considered to be the inventor of the woodwind quintet. So as I hear this piece, and of course I'm sure string players will hear it differently, as I hear this piece, it's really a concerto for woodwind quintet with, you know, strings supporting them. Although it's also true that the first violin part, when this was premiered by Joseph Joachim, who was the 19th century greatest violinist. He was a good friend of Brahms. You know, Brahms wrote the Brahms Concerto for him. He premiered it, and he premiered this piece too. So there is, of course, a flashy cadenza for the first violin as well. So,
yeah, it's 4 movements. It gives everyone a chance to shine. Stylistically, as you pointed out, you know, this being the 19th century, I think it falls along the same lines, similar sound world to Brahms, Mendelssohn, perhaps, and I find it so enjoyable because it has this kind of vast orchestral sound with the strings and winds, but being that they're all solo parts, it has an intimacy. And one thing I wanted to point out is that when we were programming for this season, we were kind of programming about a month out at a time. And once the restriction was that we couldn't perform and I know you alluded to this,
Yeah.
but this program was problematic because it's kind of this transitional program for us. We were thinking that it's possible that we might be able to expand the orchestra. And so we thought this non-net would be a great work to have as a place, like to set in place that we could definitely do. And then the Mendelssohn, which we're doing in the first half, is something we could do with 9 players if we wanted, or expand it to a little bit bigger. And I love how the two pieces match up. And it's obviously it's one of those pieces too that, as a conductor, I love to not be in the fray. If it's 9 musicians, I'd rather that they have a direct connection to each other, so that as much as we can still connect, even if distanced.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And it reminds me of the Stravinsky L'Histoire du Soldat. In that case, we did use a conductor because that piece is so intricate and so complicated that a conductor was necessary. This is a similar kind of ensemble, but in this case, the idiom makes it much easier for players to be able to do it on their own. And I think, as to go back, one of the things that's been so exciting about this season has been the way it shows the different kinds of pieces that there are. We so often think of big orchestral pieces, Brahms symphonies, chamber music pieces, Beethoven quartets, and all this, stuff in between, which asks the players to play in a very different kind of a way than they're used to playing. And I think that's one of the things you were alluding to, right? That you like to give them a chance to show off without you telling them what to do.
Absolutely. It actually, that makes me think of one thing about, when you're conducting an orchestra, that some conductors go in with the attitude of, I have this exact thing that I want to hear, and no matter what comes out in that first rehearsal, I want to change it to whatever it is that I have in my mind. And that's not the way that I typically approach. Of course, I come in with a concept, but if someone offers up a horn solo or clarinet solo and it's different than I imagined, I will very often embrace that. And then that kind of becomes this organic thing where it kind of plays off each other. And that's one of the most amazing things about chamber music, because everyone is offering it up and people are just listening and reacting. And there isn't a third party, a conductor. And I feel like I'm slamming conductors, but I know conductors are necessary in many of these situations, of course. But what we can look forward to hearing here is that people directly following each other's lead and playing off of each other's style, and you get this really organic result. And I really look forward to the performance tonight.
Yeah, and just one other thing, because, and not that our audience really needs to be reminded of this, but it's always nice to say it. We are really fortunate in Syracuse to have an orchestra with sensational principal players, top to bottom. And this is an orchestra where very often we don't get to hear, although, as you said, you let people do their own to a certain extent, in large pieces. It's not really the same thing. We don't really get to hear a whole 45 minutes, or not 45, 32 minutes of, our soloists being soloists together. So I think this reminds us, again, of how fortunate we are to have such a fabulous orchestra in Syracuse that can handle a piece like this. And as you'll see, to handle it with grace, elegance, beauty, wit, imagination, and everything else. And it's today, as we're recording this a little earlier, the weather is pretty miserable. It's a real gray day in upstate New York, like it so often is. And I just know that this concert is going to warm everybody's hearts. You're going to go out feeling so much better than when you came in. And in part, that's because of the joy that our players are going to bring into it.
Well, on that note, thank you so much, Peter, and we look forward to the performance.